The Bombardment of Alexandria in Egypt by the Royal Navy was the first engagement of the Anglo-Egyptian War of 1882. It was the beginning of a story of British involvement in Egypt that would see them fighting in the Sudan, fighting in Sinai against the Turks in World War I, and the Western Desert against Rommel in World War II, before coming to a head in the Suez Crisis in 1956. But 70 years before they were facing Gamal Nasser in the Suez Crisis, the British found themselves facing another charismatic Egyptian nationalist leader, Ahmed Urabi, who had adopted the slogan, "Egypt for the Egyptians." And following their bombardment of Alexandria, the British were to receive a stinging rebuke from one of their own MPs in the House of Commons. But why were they facing Urabi and his Egyptian forces in the first place? And why were the Royal Navy bombarding this ancient city at the mouth of the River Nile? This is the story of, and indeed behind, the bombardment of Alexandria on the 11th and 12th of July, 1882. Before we can get to the bombardment, we need to travel back to understand how both Egypt and Britain got to this place, because conflicts don't just happen out of the blue. They're the results of tensions and decisions and wrong turns taken over many years by politicians and rulers and others. For 300 years, Egypt had been part of the Ottoman or Turkish Empire. During the early 19th century, the Ottoman viceroy in Egypt, Muhammad Ali, who's actually Albanian, had become a semi-autonomous ruler and had adopted the title Khedive. And that title was passed down his family, and it was his grandson, Ismael Pasha, who embarked upon an ambitious plan to modernise Egypt, putting it on an equal footing with the European powers in the middle of the 19th century. A vast building programme saw Ismail, a keen Francophile, remodel Cairo on the Parisian model, with European-style buildings, boulevards, as well as factories and railways and stations. In 1869, the Suez Canal was opened. Run by a private company, the Suez Canal Company, owned principally by the French and Ismael Pasha himself, it enjoyed a no-cost 99-year lease of the Suez Canal land in Egypt, control of the land either side of the canal, which would ultimately become the Canal Zone, and required the Khedive to provide forced labour for its construction. Many Egyptians later said that the canal was filled with Egyptian blood, long before it was filled with water. The canal drastically reduced journey times between Europe and Asia, and for the first time in centuries, Egypt suddenly became strategically important to the European powers, especially France, co-owners of the canal, and within a few years, the United Kingdom too. Ismail's ambitions also extended to creating an Egyptian empire that would run south for the whole course of the River Nile into modern-day Uganda. He expanded Egyptian control of the Sudan, conquering the Darfur region, and creating an imperial province of Equatoria in South Sudan. It was Ismail who employed Charles Gordon and promoted him to governor of the Sudan. And indeed, it was against this Egyptian rule, rather than British rule, that the Mahdi led his war of independence. So far, so good for Ismael Pasha and Egypt. But as you might have guessed, there's a sting in the tail. All these ambitions came at a cost. And whilst Egypt's cotton industry had doubled Ismail's revenues, his expenditure outran his income. And not for the first time, a leader was forced to take out loans to fund his ambitious programmes. A programme that also included funding a disastrous war against Abyssinia or Ethiopia in the 1870s. The loans were provided by an assortment of European investors, especially from France. And those loans were charged with eye-watering interest, and repayments soon rose to half the entire state budget of Egypt. The combination of loans and expenditure on continuing capital projects, along with a good dose of mismanagement and corruption, was unsustainable. In 1875, in a desperate attempt to keep the wolves from his doors, Ismael Pasha sold his 40% shareholding in the Suez Canal to the British government under Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli at a heavily discounted rate of £4 million. And so began Britain's involvement in Egypt. Having sold off Egypt, or rather his share in the Suez Canal, Ismael Pasha found that his cash injection was swiftly used up, and within a year, Egypt was bankrupt. All those investors who had sunk cash into Egypt and received handsome rates of interest were now horribly exposed, and they lobbied their governments to act. Ismael Pasha was forced into a humiliating agreement by the European powers, where France and Britain effectively took over the revenue and expenditure controls of his government, appointing their own ministers to act with him. By 1878, they had even forced Ismail to become a constitutional monarch. But the ambitions for Egypt to stand alongside European powers, complete with their own empire in Africa, were the ambitions of a Khedive and an oligarchy who were ethnically Ottoman rather than Egyptians. If the Khedive was paying European investors for his programme, the Egyptian people were paying the Khedive through taxes and forced labour. And in 1879, his army, who were drawn from that oppressed population and whose wages were already in arrears, were put on half pay to try and balance the books. Led by an Egyptian-born officer, Ahmed Urabi, they rose in revolt. Unlike the Turkish elite that controlled the country, Urabi was a native Egyptian, born in a village on the banks of the River Nile. In his late 30s, he had observed firsthand the corruption and incompetence of that ruling elite during the Abyssinian War, just a few years beforehand. Ismael Pasha was forced to meet Urabi and his rebel soldiers, and from that meeting he sacked his pro-European Prime Minister and promised to bring the troops' pay back up to date. And then Ismael Pasha decided to play a dangerous game by allying the Egyptian soldiers' grievances with his own ambitions. Smarting from the controls placed on him by the European powers and the cost of the loans that his ambitions had created, the emboldened Khedive now dismissed those two European ministers in his government and announced his intention to cancel his country's debts. The investors once more turned to the governments of Europe for recourse. The French, who had the most investors in Egypt, applied pressure on the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, who was still nominally Ismael Pasha's boss. The British, keen not to allow the French to take control of Egypt, also decided to apply pressure on the Sultan. And with Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and the Italians also joining in the chorus, the Sultan dismissed Ismael Pasha from his position as Khedive. And, under European pressure, especially from the French and the British, he appointed Ismail's son, Tawfik, in his place. And Tawfik Pasha returned Egypt to the status quo, i.e. the two European ministers were restored and the loans, with their interest rates, remained. In September 1881, Urabi and the military once more rose in rebellion. Whilst events would later cast Urabi as anti-European, his initial aim was to actually rid Egypt of its ruling Turkish oligarchy, including the new Khedive, and he adopted a slogan, Egypt for the Egyptians. The army now forced Khedive Tawfik to appoint an Egyptian nationalist as Prime Minister, and also Urabi as Minister of War. Having done so, the Khedive fled from the capital in Cairo to his palace on the coast at Alexandria, whilst control of the country effectively swung to the Minister of War, Ahmed Urabi. And this turn of events of Egypt for the Egyptians alarmed the European powers. In January 1881, the French sent a note with the agreement of the British to the Khedive and the Egyptian government, pointing out in no uncertain terms that any changes to the existing status quo would not be allowed. If the two European powers thought that this might rein in the nationalist ambitions of Urabi and his Egyptian supporters, they were wrong. It actually had the opposite effect, directing the Egyptians' ire towards the Europeans as well as the Turks. Ratcheting things up a little bit more, in May 1882, a fleet, ultimately consisting of 15 Royal Naval ironclads under Admiral Beauchamp Seymour and 4 French warships, arrived off the Egyptian port of Alexandria to show Urabi that they were serious. And once more, this had a counterproductive effect, as you're about to find out. The arrival reminded the Egyptians that only a few years before, the French warships had arrived off the port of Tunis in North Africa, and that had resulted in a full-blown invasion as France had swallowed Tunisia into their growing North African empire. The Egyptians were alarmed that something similar was about to happen to them. Nationalist riots broke out in Alexandria, resulting in 50 Europeans being killed, countless more injured, including the British consul, who was severely beaten by a mob. A flotilla of ships from various European countries rushed to the port, and by the 6th of July, almost all Europeans living in the city had been evacuated. Admiral Seymour also offered to evacuate the Khedive from his palace in the city, but Tawfiq Pasha refused to leave his people in what he saw as their hour of need. Which is interesting because many of the rebelling Egyptian army didn't see him as one of theirs at all. Meanwhile, Urabi ordered his troops to start reinforcing the 11 forts around the harbour in Alexandria with 290 guns to deter any thoughts the British or French had of conducting a repeat of Tunis. And with 290 guns now pointing at his ships, the Royal Naval Commander, Admiral Beauchamp Seymour, was in turn starting to get concerned that this was getting out of hand. I guess it's a bit of a moot point. If his fleet of ironclads weren't moored off the harbour, Urabi's guns wouldn't be pointing at them. But that is where both sides now found themselves. It was at this moment that the French government had a change of heart and ordered their fleet to leave Alexandria and head for Port Said at the head of the Suez Canal. Seymour and his Royal Naval ironclads were on their own. Having sought and obtained position from the British government, on the 10th of July, the very day the French fleet departed, Seymour issued an ultimatum to Urabi to cease fortifying his positions within 24 hours, or he would fire on the Egyptian forts. The 61-year-old admiral had joined the Royal Navy back in 1834 when he was just 13, and he was now Commander-in-Chief of the British Mediterranean Fleet. Despite Urabi having 290 guns in 11 forts along the waterfront, Seymour had a fair bit of firepower of his own. His fleet off the shore of Alexandria consisted of 8 ironclad battleships, Her Majesty's ships Superb, Sultan, Temeraire, Inflexible, Monarch, Invincible, Penelope, and his flagship, HMS Alexandra, named after Princess Alexandra, wife of the Prince of Wales, Queen Victoria's son. Together they were joined by a torpedo boat, a dispatch boat, and 5 smaller gun vessels. Altogether, he was in command of 7,000 sailors and Royal Marines. Through the long night, the townspeople of Alexandria, the Egyptian soldiers in their forts, and those 7,000 sailors in Seymour's fleet, nervously waited for the ultimatum to expire at 7 a.m. And with no response from Urabi by the appointed hour on the 11th of July, Admiral Seymour, who had now moved to HMS Invincible, signalled to his old flagship to commence firing. At 7 a.m, HMS Alexandra opened fire on Ras El Tin Fort. The Bombardment of Alexandria had begun. The bombardment lasted for 10.5 hours as the Royal Naval Fleet fought a gunnery duel with the Egyptian forts. It was the first opportunity since the Crimean War for the Royal Navy to test their modern guns in a mass barrage on shore defences. Throughout the day, Seymour's warships grouped together to concentrate fire on individual forts, reducing them, knocking them out before moving on to the next one. The Egyptians, however, defending their homeland, refused to just be sitting ducks. Throughout the day, their guns fired back, trying to hit the British in their flanks whenever possible. They scored 24 hits on HMS Alexandra, and at one point an Egyptian live shell actually landed on the main deck, just above the hatch of the magazine. It could have been a disaster for Seymour's fleet. But suddenly, Israel Harding, a 48-year-old gunner, rushed over, grabbed the live shell with his bare hands and threw it in a tub of water, no doubt saving many of his crewmates, and possibly the ship itself. For that act of bravery, Gunner Hans was to receive the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest medal for valour. Alexandra was now joined by HMS Sultan, HMS Superb and HMS Inflexible to pour fire into Ras El Tin Fort. And just after midday, the guns in the fort fell silent. Meanwhile, another near disaster for the Royal Navy was averted when HMS Temeraire, firing on the El Max fort, managed to get herself stranded on a reef. Fortunately for the Royal Navy warship, before the Egyptian guns could be brought to bear on her, one of Seymour's smaller gun vessels, HMS Condor, came to her aid and helped refloat her. Condor now sailed to assist HMS Penelope and HMS Monarch, who was the first seagoing Royal Naval warship to carry her guns in a turret, who were attempting to silence the 24 Egyptian guns at the Marabat fort. 36-year-old Lord Charles Beresford, commander of HMS Condor, took his shallow draft ship to within 1,200 feet of the fort, under the angle of the fort's guns, and for the next hour he shelled the fort without taking a single casualty. Having decisively helped to silence the fort, Beresford saw Admiral Seymour signalling, "Well done, Condor." Beresford was immediately promoted to captain because of his actions, And Seymour's message, "Well done, Condor," was taken up by the British newspapers back home, with Beresford and Condor effectively becoming the popular heroes of this particular military action. As we moved into the afternoon, HMS Superb opened fire on Fort Adder. Superb had been built at the Thames Ironworks in East London, and it was men from these ironworks who, a few years later, would form West Ham United Football Club. At 1:30, one of her shells hit the fort's magazine, and the resulting explosion ended the resistance from the garrison. HMS Superb now joined the refloated Temeraire and HMS Inflexible under her captain, John Jackie Fisher, to bombard the forts guarding the eastern harbour, in particular the Cat Bay Citadel. This impressive fort had been built back in the 15th century on the very site of the Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. Its thick medieval walls and towers, however, were no match for the 19th century naval guns, and as the afternoon wore on, more and more holes were punched into her defences by the Royal Navy. Finally, at 5:15 in the afternoon, Seymour ordered a ceasefire. All of the Egyptian forts had been put out of action, although some only temporarily. Not a single Royal Naval ship had been lost, although HMS Flexible had been hit twice and HMS Sultan had lost 2 killed and 8 wounded when an Egyptian shell had hit part of her battery. And of course, HMS Alexandra had been hit 24 times. Seymour's fleet had fired over 1,000 shells, including 310 from HMS Superb and 231 from HMS Penelope. The following morning, the 12th of July, HMS Temeraire reported to Seymour that the hospital fort was once more being refortified. And so at 10:30, the Admiral ordered the Temeraire and John Fisher on board HMS Inflexible to open fire on the fort, which they duly did. Just 18 minutes later, the Egyptian garrison ran up a white flag. Now, an Egyptian boat made its way from the shore towards the British fleet, flying a flag of truce. Seymour ordered a general ceasefire while negotiations took place. In the middle of the afternoon, in some sort of confusion, one of the gun vessels, HMS Britain, now suddenly signalled to the fleet that the negotiations had broken down and that the bombardment was to resume. But looking towards the shores, the captains of the Royal Naval ironclads could see that all the forts were still flying white flags. Confusion reigned in the British fleet, and some of the captains opened up an erratic bombardment, while others demurred. Within an hour, Seymour had restored control of his fleet and ordered yet another ceasefire. But as the guns fell silent, a new sound was heard. The sound of the city on fire. It's estimated that anything up to 30% of the British shells fired in the previous 36 hours had missed the forts and hit civilian areas nearby, some of which had started fires. However, even more fires were started by local Egyptians looting European and Coptic Christian properties and businesses near the waterfront. That night, the ancient city of Alexandria burned out of control. The fires and looting lasted for 2 days, during which many lawless citizens were joined by lawless members of Urabi's Egyptian army. Now, some have argued that Urabi encouraged this behaviour by his soldiers, others that he merely turned a blind eye, whilst others argue that he was actually far more interested in working out his next strategic move rather than policing the European properties in Alexandria. We'll never really know. But on the 14th of July, confident that the Egyptian garrison had effectively left the city, Seymour finally landed 500 to 600 sailors and Royal Marines to protect property and restore some form of order in the city. And so ended the Bombardment of Alexandria, the first part of the Anglo-Egyptian War. The British had lost 5 men killed and 27 wounded. The Egyptian army claimed that 150 of their men had been killed and a further 400 wounded. Seymour was raised to a peerage as Baron Ulster. He was given the freedom of the City of London and a parliamentary grant of £25,000 for his actions here at Alexandria. Beresford, of HMS Condor fame, would go on to become an admiral in his own right, and would become a bitter rival of another admiral who had served in the Bombardment of Alexandria, John Jackie Fisher, who would become the first Sea Lord and oversee the building of the dreadnoughts to counter the Kaiser's navy in the early 1900s. Not that everyone in Britain saw the British actions as glorious or justified. Prime Minister Gladstone and fellow Cabinet Minister John Bright had actually voted against supporting Seymour's ultimatum in the first place, but had been outvoted in the British Cabinet. Another Liberal MP, the campaigning Welshman Henry Richard, condemned the actions of the Royal Navy and the British government in the following terms. "I find a man prowling around my house with obvious felonious purposes," he said, referring to the arrival of the ironclads of Alexandria. "I hasten to get locks and bars and to barricade my windows," he continued, drawing the comparison with the Egyptians fortifying their position. "And he says this is an insult and a threat to him, and he batters down my doors, and he declares he only does so as an act of strict self-defence." Certainly Urabi and his supporters would probably have agreed with Henry Richard MP. Rescued from his palace by Seymour sailors, Khedive Pasha was to rule Egypt for another 10 years. His first action upon being rescued was to dismiss Urabi from his post as Minister of War. But Urabi's dismissal was immaterial to the realities on the ground. He controlled the Egyptian army, many of whose officers had received European warfare training from the French. Urabi also had the overwhelming support of the Egyptian people. Unlike the Ottoman Khedive who talked about his people, Urabi was one of the people. He was one of their own, a man from a village on the banks of the River Nile, and it was his call of Egypt for the Egyptians that they responded to. And that battle cry, which had originally been aimed at the Ottoman oligarchy, was now broadened into an anti-European agenda. The Europeans who had bled Egypt dry with their loans and interest rates, the Europeans who controlled the Suez Canal running through Egyptian territory, the Europeans represented by France and Britain who actually controlled the most important ministries in the Egyptian government, the Europeans, or more precisely the British and their Royal Navy, who had just bombarded the ancient port of Alexandria. Urabi withdrew his forces inland towards the capital Cairo. Whilst he'd been forced to abandon Alexandria, he still controlled the rest of the country and was in a position to make good on his cry, "Egypt for the Egyptians," by seizing the Suez Canal. And it was this threat to their interest in the Suez Canal and the impact on their Asian empire that now forced the British to try and shut the lid on the Pandora's box, which by their very actions had sprung open. Like it or not, the British needed to finish the job. Urabi and his nationalists had to be stopped. The Bombardment of Alexandria in Egypt by the Royal Navy was the first engagement of the Anglo-Egyptian War of 1882. It was the beginning of a story of British involvement in Egypt that would see them fighting in the Sudan, fighting in Sinai against the Turks in World War I, and the Western Desert against Rommel in World War II, before coming to a head in the Suez Crisis in 1956. But before all of that, the British would need to take on and defeat Ahmed Urabi. And to defeat this charismatic Egyptian, they would call upon one of Victorian Britain's most preeminent generals, Sir Garnet Wolseley. The showdown between these two leaders and their armies will be the subject of my next video, the Battle of Tel El Kebir. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that video and found the story interesting. Don't forget to give me a like, and how about joining my History Chap supporters club? What's that all about? Well, click on the link that's going to appear in a moment. Loads more videos coming your way, but in the meantime, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.